Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar. Today we have Guy Rimby with us. He's going to be presenting the key benefits of using an accelerated shelf life study. Guy graduated from Drake University with a Bachelor's of Science in Biochemistry and Cell and Molecular Biology with concentrations in genetics and analytical chemistry. He has over 3 years of experience in the food testing industry at Eurofins. During this period of time, Guy's been responsible for the setup, coordination, and reporting of more than 700 shelf life studies. Before we get started, we'd like to just review a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and will be available within the next 2 days for viewing. We're going to go ahead and email that recording out to all of you as well as the slides, so you'll have those after the presentation. Go ahead and submit your questions throughout the presentation and we'll address them at the end. But any questions that we don't get to due to any time constraints, or if you come up with some after the fact, we can respond to via email. To submit your question, you want to click on the GoToWebinar dashboard, type in your question, and then click Send. So that's all we've got for housekeeping. We can go ahead and turn things over to Guy.
Hello, everyone. First off, I wanted to go ahead and review the purpose of shelf life testing. And the purpose of shelf life testing is to establish a printed expiry date on a product. So what that means is that's going to give you your best by dates, your expiration dates, your sell by dates, use by dates. That's the goal of a shelf life study. And we're going to gauge that by looking at quality factors related to the quality of the product and the safety of the product. Now, some of the stuff we'll touch on will be a review from the previous webinar that was presented in May of 2014, if you attended that one. The one in May gave a lot more detail on the front end of a study, on what goes into setting it up, and how to pick your testing and full intervals. So if you'd like to look at that, there's a link provided here to be able to go ahead and reference that webinar for a general shelf life study guidance. This one's going to focus a lot more specifically on accelerated studies. So the purpose of accelerated studies is that you're looking to provide an early indication on longer-term effects of non-accelerated conditions and the effects of short-term excursions outside your label storage conditions. So let's say your product is normally stored in room temperature conditions. An accelerated study would be beneficial for justifying maybe having shipping that does not allow the product to go above that room temperature condition. Also, what you see accelerated studies utilize most often for is, let's say you've got a product that you want to put out on the market within the next year, but you want to claim a 2-year shelf life on it. Well, you won't be able to finish that 2 years of room temperature data before you want to get your product out in that 1 year. So what people will do is they'll set up, say, a 6-month shelf life study or a 12-month shelf life study, and they will get as much data as they can from the accelerated conditions, and they'll plot their trends compared to what is going on with their product in ambient conditions, in that room temperature condition, and you can extrapolate outwards then to predict whether or not your product will hit that 2 years based on the data that you've achieved from your accelerated testing. And because of that, because the accelerated testing is different from the ambient, it can be used to justify your shelf life claims, but it's still suggested that you carry out a real-time ambient condition as soon as feasible to verify the data that you've attained and extrapolated from your accelerated study. It's important to note that not all accelerated studies can be 100% predictive of real-time dating. Regulatory bodies will look at it as a form of due diligence if you've done the testing to show proof of your label claims. However, sometimes if you look at some products that are very susceptible to those higher temperatures, sometimes products like chocolates or certain types of supplemental gummies, those types of products can deteriorate very quickly in accelerated conditions, and can sometimes give a poor extrapolation for the regular real-time storage conditions. If you use the ICH guidelines in general, but not limited to, accelerated studies can extend anywhere from 3 to 6 months and sometimes up to a year as a way of predicting shelf life for up to 2 years, and again, sometimes longer for your more shelf-stable products. And what you want to do during that period is you want to analyze the product enough times to get sufficient data for plotting and trending of your results. That's why sometimes we'll get a client who wants to run 1, 2, or 3 intervals of testing in an accelerated study, and until you get to that third or further point, you really can't extrapolate any type of plotting out there. So I tend to discourage anyone who only wants a couple points, because you will only be able to develop a linear regression at that point, and you really need to determine whether or not your product has a deterioration rate that has a more exponential slope to it. One of the other things that can be used is intermediate testing. So that's going to give you a condition that's between the temperature and humidity conditions of accelerated and ambient conditions. And the same points apply here that were just covered in the slides for accelerated. The other things that you can use intermediate testing for, as I mentioned, some of those products like chocolates and gummies that don't really withstand the 40 degrees Celsius and 75% relative humidity that you'll see inside accelerated conditions. And the other thing is it's also defined to be used for an ambient condition for zone 4 regions, which I'll go into in this slide here. So what you see here on this slide is the International Conference on Harmonization's guidelines for stability zones. Zone 2 is going to be the one that's going to be most commonly used for our clients, because those are what we deal with most often, our North American and Western European clients, and that's what's going to apply for Zone 2. So that's where you see your 25 degrees Celsius and 60% relative humidity as your ambient long-term real-time condition. When I say words like long-term, room temperature, ambient, those are words that are often used interchangeably for shelf-stable products, so products that you can store outside of refrigerated and frozen conditions. So your very shelf-stable products, their long-term ambient room temperature condition is going to be 25 degrees Celsius, 60% relative humidity. You'll see, and please note there, that Zone 4, which is used for your tropical zones, that has the 30 degrees Celsius and 65% relative humidity, and that is what you'll see there at the bottom of this page as being referred to as intermediate. So if you're a Zone 2 resident, basically, company that's marketing in Zone 2, your intermediate condition will be the same as Zone 4. So for companies that are looking to market their product in Central America, certain South American countries, you're going to see the Zone 4 be the recommended conditions by the ICH as well as the World Health Organization. The Zone 4B is used by the Southeast Asian countries as well as some of the equatorial South American countries. One of the other things I really wanted to point out with the zones here is what happens with different type of storage conditions. So you hear the term accelerated thrown out a lot, and the general assumption when you hear accelerated is 40% or 40 degrees Celsius, 75% relative humidity, and that's because most of the products that we deal with are going to be shelf stable and run at an ambient room temperature condition of 25 degrees Celsius, 60% relative humidity. Therefore, their accelerated condition is going to be that 40 degrees Celsius, 75% relative humidity. However, if your product is normally stored refrigerated, the way that you put that in accelerated condition then is you put that into a stress temperature condition that's greater than what it normally would be. So instead of storing it at its long-term conditions at 5 degrees Celsius, An accelerated refrigerated study would be stored at our ambient conditions of 25 degrees Celsius, 60% relative humidity that you'll see right down here. And then continuing on, same logic with frozen conditions, which are normally stored at negative 15 degrees Celsius. When you want to stress your frozen condition, then you'd store it in refrigeration at 5 degrees Celsius. So now when we store our products, we're going to put them in what we have here at Eurofins are state-of-the-art environmental chambers. And what these chambers are able to do is regulate temperature and humidity at a very static rate. So we see almost no change in the day-to-day temperature and humidity. And what's going on in these pieces of equipment is these chambers have a unit behind them that you can't see in this picture, but what it's doing is it's taking water and it's warming or cooling the water to flow through a piping system within the unit so that it's a very consistent temperature regulation, where in older units what you would see is it would be forced air and it could cause spikes in the temperature regulation. Another thing that these units will do is they create humidity through ultrasonication. So we're talking about very high rates of vibration in order to vaporize water and then release it as water vapor inside the chambers to regulate humidity. The older chambers, what you'd see is it would boil water to create steam, and again, it would cause those spikes in temperature because you're introducing those the warm steam into the chamber instead of the basically neutral temperature of the water vapor that's being created through ultrasonication. And the reason it's important to use chambers like this is because environment is one of our shelf life factors. So when we look at shelf life factors, we want to try to eliminate as many variables as possible. So by using chambers like that that keep a very static temperature and relative humidity, we take out those variables, as humidity and temperature will not be, the change in humidity and temperature will not be the reason why we're experiencing deterioration then. And that's another reason why you'll see packaging as another thing on this graph, on this picture here, because one of the things we always stress is when you send in your study, please use packaging that best reflects what you're going to send to market. And the reason being is because if you're going to use something that has an oxygen barrier, if you're going to use something that has a moisture barrier, we want that replicated because we want to eliminate that variable from the deterioration of the product. So if you're vacuum sealing, if you have a certain amount of headspace that you always use in your product, this needs to be consistent. If you flush your product with nitrogen to prevent oxidation, again, these are all things that go into packaging because we're trying to eliminate variables, because when it comes down to it, we want to really be analyzing the deterioration rate from the food itself. So if we keep packaging consistent, if we use controls in our packaging to prevent oxygen and moisture from entering the packaging, and we use these chambers that we have to prevent fluctuation in temperature and relative humidity, then it's truly the food formulation itself that we're charting for its deterioration. The next thing you want to look at is the steps of determining your quality factors. So what is going to decide that your food product is no longer at the level you want it and that it's no longer shelf stable? So you want to look at what type of primary and secondary quality factors you have. So this is something that we referred to in the previous webinar of trying to decide which type of we refer to them as your bioactives, your microbiology, your lipid rancidity, and your organoleptics. And these are some of the things that you can choose as your primary and secondary quality factors. So maybe your big concern with your product is microbial growth. So maybe that's your primary quality factor, and then your secondary quality factor may be, if you've got a high-fat product, it could be lipid oxidation. It could be that your product is extremely shelf-stable, and the only thing that you're really worried about is the color or the aroma that your product gives off. And these are things that you can choose as your main quality factors, and those are going to be the factors that you you want to test for most repeatedly in your pull intervals. Once you establish your quality factors, you want to determine your critical limits. So when we talk about setting up protocols for these stability studies, some of the things that our sales staff will ask is, what are your expected levels? And the reason we ask that is is so that we can determine when your product starts to degrade past its critical limit. So if you have a product, say, that has a certain level of vitamin C, and you're claiming the vitamin C on your label, you'll want to make sure that it stays at that level, at least 75% of your label claim through your shelf life claim. So that'll be one of the critical limits that you would set inside your study setup. It could also be that, I mentioned the lipid oxidation, it could be that you set a criteria that your critical limit for lipid oxidation is having a PV of, say, 20 MEQs per kilogram. And those are things that you'll want to set as your critical limits. Again, I mentioned the color of the product. Maybe you have some sort of product that experiences oxidation. Maybe it's a product that has greens in it, and you want to check to see how long it can go before it starts to brown. So that, again, would be something that you would set as your critical limit. And once you get those, then you can start to chart your deterioration rate. That's the third step. So once you start obtaining your data through our pull intervals, you'll be able to chart that data, and then you can extrapolate out to ultimately establish and estimate your shelf life. So the next couple of slides that you'll see here are some great pieces of graphs that were prepared by Dr. Kit Yam, who is a professor at Rutgers, who is in charge of their graduate program for food science and packaging. So what you'll see here, when you look at a deterioration rate, the deterioration rate is indicative of the chemistry and biology of the food. So you'll see that your quality factor goes down as your storage time continues. And the way that you plot that is with the data that you obtain from your shelf life study from each pull interval. What we have to establish at the start of the study, though, is what is our critical limit. So at what point is the food maybe no longer safe for consumption? At what point is the food no longer appealing to the customer? Does it have an off aroma or off taste due to lipid oxidation? These are all things that we need to establish beforehand so we can set a critical limit. When these two things work together, you'll be able to determine your shelf life. So at what point does your deterioration rate cross your critical limit? When that happens, that's where your shelf life exists. So it could be possible that one of the aspects of your shelf life lasts longer than another. So this is what these graphs here are indicative of. So the quality factors that are on these graphs, you'll see, are organoleptic type factors. So you see color, taste, texture. Now, over the course of time, over the same course of storage, you'll see that the texture is the most stable, color is next, and then the taste is the least stable. So that becomes your primary quality factor because the taste is going to be the first thing to go. And now this very well could be changed to where your quality factors instead maybe are your microbial plate counts, your peroxide value for lipid oxidation, and again, your color. And maybe the thing that goes first for your product would be the microbial counts, and then that would then become your primary quality factor. One thing that Eurofins will provide is result summaries throughout the course of a study, and this allows for easy client interpretation. So here I've prepared an example here of what we'll give you. It's an Excel file with all your data points. And what we can also do is we can take these data points and also plot them for you and prepare you graphs in Excel that look very much like these types of graphs here so that you can compare and see where they start to cross your expected levels and where you meet your critical limits. I think this slide here really best illustrates what the accelerated studies are all about. So when you estimate your shelf life, you'll see here that we've got 3 different storage conditions plotted out here over the course of time. And you see the critical limit is never reached during those pull intervals for the ambient studies, which is your real-time long-term temperature. So what we're seeing here is the accelerated study hits the critical limit at a certain time point, and now because of that, because we've got those multiple points, we've got at least 4 points in each of these conditions now, we're able to extrapolate out and see and predict where our ambient condition is finally going to cross that critical limit because we've got the data obtained from the accelerated study. So harkening back to what I mentioned earlier, where you've got X amount of time to get your product out and you don't have enough time to do a long-term storage, this would be a great illustration of how you still prove your long-term storage condition with accelerated studies. So you get your time points, you get as many intervals in as you can, you build a trend line off of accelerated, and then you see where your ambient points are, and you apply that degradation through the critical limit to predict where your ambient study is going to be. One of the things I wanted to point out, which is a great tool for use, because maybe you want to use something other than Excel. Maybe you feel more comfortable. Maybe you don't feel too comfortable with Excel. A great resource is the USDA, and the USDA has a free software. If you follow the link provided here, you'll go in and they've got this window set up. You see it's a little blurry, but I promise you it's a very helpful tool, and it's very self-guided, and there's an entire tutorial on the website as well. And what you're able to do is you enter your data in, and you can adjust it to build a curve with the raw data that you've obtained through your shelf life studies. And what you're able to do is you're able to build some curves and models. So, for instance, looking at some of these curves, what these would be indicative of is the one up in the upper left. That could be very similar to what you might see with some microbial growth, where it starts off and then the product basically maxes out with the amount of nutrients that it's able to provide for microbial growth, and you can see that it goes above maybe what your critical limit would be then. The one on the top right, that's very indicative of vitamin degradation. So you could see maybe at a certain point along that y-axis, maybe you would have a critical limit of what your nutritional label claim was. And then if you look at the one on the bottom, that's what you could see with peroxide values, where your peroxide values continue to rise, and then at a certain point, the peroxides start to form aldehydes, and it rapidly drops off. So that would be what you would see with a graph like that. At some point in there, again, you would have your critical limit for your liquid oxidation with your peroxide values. One of the things I wanted to review, we mentioned what you're able to get from your shelf life studies is an expiry date. And this was covered in the first webinar last May, but it's important to understand what these terms mean. So at the end of your shelf life study, you'll have the data you need to, if you run a real-time study, you'll have the exact data. But if you have an accelerated study, you can then extrapolate outwards and determine these shelf life terms. So when you see expiration date, an expiration date, or EXP, on the product is a date for the last date that food can be safely eaten or used. So this is an implication of food safety. There are also non-food safety related dates which are related to quality. If you see a best by date or best if used by date, these are dates that are recommended for best flavor or quality. So what that's usually indicative of is your organoleptic testing. So did the product start to turn a certain color at this date? Was the flavor off at that point? Did it start to have a stale aroma? That's where you're going to see your best by dates used. It's not that there was any type of microbial growth that was presented. It's not that the food was unsafe to eat, but it was no longer really as appealing to the customer. You'll see use by date sometimes, and what the use by date is the last date recommended for use of product while still at peak quality. So this is really big with clients who have nutritional labels that make claims on things such as your vitamins, for instance, where a certain vitamin may then drop below 75% of the label claim. So, if you're claiming that the product is a great source of, say, vitamin C or a great source of vitamin D, if those vitamins then drop below 75% or whatever you establish as your quality matrix, that's where you would use the use by date. And then finally, you have your sell by date, which what this does is it tells stores how long to display the product. So this is really to help stores and manufacturers planning their production schedule, basically. And then just quickly to give some, I wanted to make sure to give credit where it was due. Dr. Kit Yem from Rutgers was the individual I was able to get those graphs from that you saw midway through the presentation. And then Dr. Li-Hong Wang works with the USDA in the Eastern Regional Research Center, and he's actually the one who developed the free software that you can use on the USDA website to plot graphs and curves. Finally, I just wanted to end with any questions, and if you have any questions regarding costs and setup concerns, please click on the link below to send our sales representatives an email, or you can reach us directly by the telephone number listed below.
Great, thanks guys. We have some questions that came in throughout the presentation. I want to just start with, if you share a chamber with other products, how do you eliminate cross-contamination? So for example, if a product has high content of fungi, it will most likely have spores on the outside of packaging. So how would you prevent that from contaminating other products in the chamber?
So we do try to segregate the products as much as possible within the chamber. So each study is given its own designated space within the chamber. Now, if a product is sporulating a lot, we have had this happen once before where we did a full-scale decontamination of the chamber. But again, that was a one-time occurrence, and we saw no issues with any of the other studies because it was caught right away. But basically, the chambers are cleaned on a consistent basis, and that is one of the things is there could be potential for microbes to be released, but if your product is packaged well, it should not enter any of the other the studies. We haven't had any issues with it during my almost 4 years now of conducting the studies here.
Okay. The next question is, what are some measures of decay for aqueous ingestible products like liquid teas?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, sorry. What are some measures of decay for aqueous ingestible products like liquid teas?
We do get some beverage studies in, and I think microbial assays would be the most helpful. So you definitely would want to use a microbiology array of testing. So you'd use yeast and mold, aerobic plate count. It is important to gauge something like pH there because you could see sometimes bacterial growth can alter the pH of a product. And then other than that, depends on whether or not the tea is making any label claims for nutritional facts. So if there's any type of vitamins that may have been added to the tea, that would be something else that you'd want to test as well.
All right. Next question is, what is the ratio of normal shelf life and accelerated shelf life? And then what's the science behind it?
Okay, so for the most part, if you haven't run accelerated and ambient studies yet, and you haven't been able to establish your own ratio for your product, what we reference is the ICH, which if you remember that slide from earlier, they suggest a 2-to-1 ratio. So the ICH, say if you have a 2-year shelf life claim that you want to make, they would suggest that if you're going to have a 2-year shelf life on a product stored in room temperature conditions, they would suggest a 1-year ambient shelf life study. Now, that doesn't always apply. So if you have a product that may be less stable than that, what you would want to do is basically run an accelerated study with, say, maybe for 6 months with time points every month so you can see what type of degradation your product's getting, and then you could chart that out. And you know, sometimes we have seen where a product could have a 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 ratio, just because it could be more stable than what the ICH guidelines recommend. So.
Great. I just have one more that I have here. Is basically, how would you decide on doing an accelerated shelf life study versus just a regular shelf life study? Why would you choose to do that?
So the number one reason why people select to do accelerated studies is because they want the data quickly, and they need the data quickly. So again, I'll use the example of, say you have a product, if you look back, let's say we'll take John Smith beef jerky that was used for the example earlier. And let's say John Smith was going to claim that his product was good for 2 years. Problem is, he wants to put that on the market by the end of the year. He doesn't have enough time to run the ambient study to get 2 years worth of data to make his claim. So what he'll do instead is he'll run an accelerated study for a year and gather time points at least every 3 months so that he can build a trend line to extrapolate out how long his product would be good for in ambient conditions then. And a lot of times what you'll see is someone will also, John Smith would also be running an ambient condition during that same time period so that he could plot his ambient points against his accelerated points so that you get a better extrapolation with his data.
Great, great, thank you. I don't have any more questions at this time. If anybody thinks of some questions that they'd like for Guy to answer, please go ahead and reach out to us with the contact information provided on screen. Otherwise, I'd just like to remind you that the webinar was recorded, and we will distribute that recording as well as the slides to you via email, and you should receive that within the next business day. And with that, we're going to go ahead and close up for today. So thank you guys for the presentation.
Thank you.